What's your favorite thing about continuous delivery?
What I like the most is just the fact that it lets you get good things done quickly, but also correct mistakes quickly, right? The train keeps moving, but the size of what's on the actual boxcars is smaller. There's a marketing strategy and PR strategy, and how that aligns with continuous is tough.
Hi, I'm Paul Bigger, founder of Circle CI.
I'm Edith Harba, CEO and co-founder at LaunchDarkly.
And you're listening to Be Continuous, a podcast about continuous delivery and software development.
You can get in touch with us anytime at our Twitter handle @ContinuousCast.
The show is brought to you by HeavyBit. To learn more, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, check out their library, home to great educational talks from other developer company founders and industry leaders.
In this episode, we talk with Kevin Henrikson, an engineering director for Microsoft Outlook. Kevin talks about succeeding with continuous delivery and mobile development.
All right, Kevin, so what's your favorite thing about continuous delivery?
Good question. I think so. Acompli started kind of the approach when we first started was just a couple people. And our deal was like, hey, you're trying to get this thing to work, send emails. So it was like, keep checking it in and get closer and closer to kind of the definition of it was working. And then as we started to experiment farther out, we said, what's the right sprint cadence? And we'd come from kind of traditional enterprise companies where, you ship every 6 weeks or every 4 weeks. And we're like, oh, we can go faster. People are doing this agile thing. It's like 2-week sprints. And we tried 2 weeks and realized that most of the work came in on Thursday afternoon or Friday kind of thing, because the end of the second week. And so, well, what if we just do 1 week? Then most of that work will come in, the first Friday. And sure enough, it worked, right? 80-some% of the work still comes in on the last day or kind of completes on the last day or gets to the point of ready. And so what we liked is that it gave us a much smaller kind of chunk of deliverable, right? So like the train keeps moving, but the size of what's on the actual boxcars is smaller. And so if you have a problem, it's easier to roll back, easier to fix. Or if you have a problem, you can just patch it quickly because you're used to moving quickly, right?
Wow.
Whereas,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, so on the kind of traditional world where, you ship something every 6 weeks, like you're like, oh, well, we made a mistake. We need to go patch this. Like the patch felt like an exception. And you're like, your muscle memory for patching was not there, right? So you're like, we do it now. Is it worth it? And then it's like, well, if you're 5 weeks in and you discover that thing, it's like, well, the 6-week thing is out there where if you're shipping every week, you're like, oh, let's patch it. We're like, oh, sweet, we shipped yesterday. We just click the button again and it builds and it goes, right? So you've built the muscle memory to move quickly, right? And so I think what I like the most, kind of going back to the specific question, is just the fact that it lets you, get good things done quickly, but also correct mistakes quickly, right?
Wow. So this is a good time for you to introduce yourself.
Cool. So Kevin Henrikson, I currently manage the Outlook kind of non-Windows teams at Microsoft. So Outlook for iOS, Android, and Mac. Previously, I was VP of Engineering of Acompli, which was a mobile startup focused on iOS and Android.
Yeah, so you had a lot of good thoughts right then. One of the things I wanted you to talk more about is, why do you think 70 or 90% of the work is always on the last day?
Yeah, I think people are kind of deadline driven. I think generally they say, hey, they want to work to the last minute. And I think software development ends up being this thing where you're never done. And so the only way to define done is to actually draw a line and say this is done, and then still some things still miss that line. And so the tighter you give the window for things to get done, the more often they'll hit that window, right? Because you've kind of broke things into smaller chunks, right? It also, because software is kind of this long-lasting thing that never is kind of done, that you end up with, if the chunks are small, people are able to estimate and think through. It's like, oh, is that going to take me a day? Very rarely does somebody think something's going to take them a day that takes months. But very often, like if you think something will take months, it may take many, many months, right? Like, because it's just, It's hard to guess how, because it's just, there's so many variables and so many things are going to change in the environment or in what you're doing before you get there. So I think the short answer is if you start with a smaller window and more discrete small tasks, those tasks are easier to estimate. They're easier to consume. They're easier if you get disturbed, like, oh, I'm going to go down and get a soda, or somebody asks me a random question because some fire comes up. I'm still, like, I can kind of make it up because I was only expecting to spend half my day working on that anyways. And so I think that kind of works out in our favor.
So there's an implication with what you said there that the task sort of grew because it was 2 weeks rather than,
Yes.
So I guess the phrasing is, when it was 2 weeks, was it that a 1 week task had grown to 2 weeks? Or was it that things got cut when it got shrunk down to 1 week and you ended up with technical debt or something along those lines?
I think it was a couple combinations, right? So I think the if you feel like you have 2 weeks to work on a task, you will spend more time kind of polishing or potentially doing things that aren't on the critical path to getting it done. And I think that's natural, right? Like maybe it is you're paying off too much technical debt, right? In the startup world, like you have to kind of have that lever And even in just kind of, general software development, like you have to have a lever. We're not launching the space shuttle here. Like there's room for like some wiggle room and imperfection. And I think breaking it into small pieces lets people, focus on, hey, I'm only going to do this and I have this much time to do it. Where you say, hey, it's got 2 weeks. You may be, deep into the second week and saying, I just don't like my approach. I'm going to change it. And you basically end up throwing away a week's of work. Whereas if you're thinking that, hey, the deadline's coming in a week, you're going to make that kind of epiphany like, oh, I made a mistake or I've taken the wrong path much quicker. So I think it allows you to kind of break your decision making and optimize on getting it done, because the window is kind of quickly approaching being a 1 week sprint versus 2.
This might sound like 7-minute abs, but why not 2-day sprints?
Yeah, so I think we and 2 days are great things, right? Or 1 day sprints, right? And how do you continue to make it faster? So for us, there was sort of one artificial gate, which was the fact that you really can't ship quicker than about a week with Apple. And even then, it sometimes slips by because 4 or 5 days, and during a peak season, if there's lots of apps like on Christmas holiday or around a new platform update, you'll see a spike in the review times. And so Apple we were an iOS app first before we ported to Android. And so that ended up driving us towards a little bit to a week, because it was like, if you shipped on Monday, the app would get in the store, sometime end of that week. And that was a natural cadence to kind of start the next one. So it's really hard without kind of pushing the emergency release button, which Apple only lets you do once or twice a year, to ship more than once a week. And then we kind of let the rest of the team fall behind that, right? If you're only shipping the app once a week, let's keep the new chunks of new work or big bug fixes to that path on our service and the way our architecture is, and we can talk about that more, but we spend as much, 70% of the logic or the ant is down deep in the service, because that we can update all the time. So, hey, we push a release out, I want to fix something, we fix it in the service the same day, right?
Oh, interesting.
And so that allows us to have a much more kind of agile approach, because the service is constantly being updated, but the app is kind of gated in 1 week chunks.
So what you're saying is that the biggest impediment to you shipping frequently is Apple.
The platform, yeah. The platform, basically Apple's review, and specifically it's the fact that Apple has a review process, which is great, right? Like that Apple review process, generally keeps the bar of apps better and kind of puts some good discipline inside of the wider range of development people that are coming to the Apple platform. But it also, when you want to move quickly, you can't, right? You're basically, the platform itself kind of enforces this 4 to 7 day lag in shipping.
So you're now running teams that are shipping on non-Apple platforms.
Correct.
Did you guys make any changes to your release cadence as a result of that?
Yeah, so I think on Android, for example, we still kind of keep to like the 1 week chunk of, we plan a sprint, build for a week, release to our beta group or dog food users, and then release to production. But Android gives you this advantage where you can do percent-based rollout. And so with Android, we end up releasing usually 2 or 3 times a week. So you'll release kind of the release on Monday at like 1 to 2%, kind of walk that up 3, 5, 10%. Usually at 5 or 10%, you can pick some new signal of crash or behavior that you want to adjust, make a hot fix, push another release, start at 10%, 20%. You see another one you want to tweak, hit 20%, and then finally from 20 or 30, you end up going all the way to 100.
Right. Do those Android users help you on the other platforms as well? Are they finding crashes that also exist on the other platforms?
So today we're 100% native on both, so there's no shared code between iOS and Android.
Wow.
From the mobile app perspective. Obviously from the service, it's 100% shared code. And so what we've actually done in the past is when we launch a new feature that we think is either controversial or has a high chance of risk, for example, when we launched IMAP support, we launched generic IMAP support on Android first, knowing that we could patch it quickly and adjust if things went wrong, simply because there was no way to test the millions of random IMAP servers in the world and get any kind of focus thing. Where we talk to Gmail or Yahoo or iCloud,
right.
single point.
That's really interesting, actually. The idea that because the rollout or the sort of safety features are only supported on Android, that people will end up building features there first.
Yeah.
How deliberate did you have to be about putting stuff in the service versus in the apps, or was this a lesson you learned?
So we had always thought of the service as the place where we wanted to do as much of the logic that could break or is hard, right? You just don't want to do it twice. Like you don't want to implement Active Sync twice. You don't want to implement an IMAP stack twice. And it also allowed us to pick a protocol between our cloud service and the mobile app that was optimized for mobile, right? So, think of the API, shape of the API looks closer to the screen of the app, right? There's a request for get my inbox and then make a change. And where if you think of IMAP or the myriad of email protocols that we talk today, they don't have that very linear type of approach of give me this screen, give me that screen. They're thought of in a way where you're going to sync all the mail down to your desktop client and then manipulate it locally and then sync changes back up in some, either connected or disconnected state. And so the service was basically set to put complex logic, but also to allow us to get leverage, because everything we could build in the service was one less thing we'd have to do twice on the client, because we picked a path that we didn't support. We didn't basically have a lot of shared code in the client. There's essentially none, just the API. And
it's the same service that sits behind all of the different clients on
That's
different
correct. Yeah, so we have a single cloud service that basically powers both the iPhone client and the Android clients.
That's interesting. So I was at TripIt, and we had a lot of similar issues. Like, we were at one time one of the biggest OAuth users of Gmail.
Okay, awesome.
Because people would sync their Gmail
Calendars.
with us and their calendars. Did you find there was a difference between the UE or the app experience that Android and iOS wanted, and how much did you bifurcate that?
For sure. So a lot of people ask is like, hey, did you launch a feature first on Android or iOS, or do you always have to make them come out identical? And my answer to that's pretty simple. It's like, most normal people carry one phone. They're either an Android user or an iPhone user. And so they don't know that you released it first on Android or iPhone, because you didn't tell, they don't carry both phones. And so we think of that from a feature point of view. When they're done, we ship it. Now, if we're trying to line a press event around something, we want to make sure that they're both there before we do the press event. One may come out a day or two before the other. But generally speaking, we don't try to, legislate like, hey, you have to do it this way because it works on iPhone. And in fact, we actually took a different approach where we said, hey, we wrote it one way on iPhone, and then when we went to Android, it wasn't just like, oh, go port all the screens over. It was like, what would this screen look like for an Android user? So we want our apps on the mobile device, and most mobile users want to look at an app and feel like it fits in with the rest of their phone. And so the way that an Android navigation works, the way that people use the back button or not, is very different on iPhone and Android. And the fact that there's widgets, and the way that the widgets are exposed on Android, and the way that most people want to integrate deeper into the platform. And so those kind of things we let go with the platform. And so our view was, write it in native code because it allows us to take advantage and move quickly to the platform specific features, but it also lets us tailor the experience and the UI and the UX to whatever that user base wants.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about it that way, because in the old days, it's kind of 10 years ago, when people were making multi-platform applications, there was a tendency of people to try to make it all match to the same. The Firefox is a good example here, or Chrome, or kind of one of those tools that people use on all platforms, was designed to look the same on every machine, even though people didn't have that multiple machine. And I think one of the nice thing that's happened with the mobile ecosystem is that people have thrown away that concept, and they've made it actually feel native for each of the platforms.
Yeah, and I think that also goes to feature set, right? Like, you would think of like a traditional app as like, oh, if it works this way on Mac or on Windows or on the web, you would expect 100% kind of feature parity between all those platforms. And today on mobile, we go and select what do you actually use. And there's features that exist in mobile only, right? Because mobile has all this additional context of your location and where you are and what you're doing. Are you running? Are you driving? Right? There's other sensors in the devices today that allow you to build specific features that are richer. And so, we always thought of, at a company now, like, is rather than sending more email, send better email, right? Like, don't say I'm running late, say I'm running late and I'm here, and send a quick tap of a button to put the map and show you that, oh, I'm 20 minutes away, or I'm on the train, or I'm at the train station. And so people can understand, like, you don't have to type out how many minutes it's going to take. You don't know, right? Like, are you walking? Are you driving? Like,
well, and plus people lie all the time. Like, I'm on my way has a pretty loose meaning of anywhere from I might leave my house in 30 minutes to...
and depending on the context, right, and what that person's thinking. So, yeah, good point.
So one of the interesting things that you said there is that it might take a day or two. When you're trying to launch something, they might actually land a day or two apart. And on this show, one of the things we try to do is we try to pitch Edith's business, which is feature flags as a service at
I never knew you did that, Paul.
It would seem to me that a kind of best practice there is to release the code and not have the code be a blocker on the launch. So the code is there, but it's behind a feature flag. Yep. Do you guys do that much?
So we have feature flags, we have flight, we call it flighting, same idea. And so we launch all kinds of dark features on the server in particular. So there's all kinds of things that we've built that are currently in production on the service that the production app may not take advantage of, right? Great example is like we launched avatar support, and it fit with the UI of Android better, and so we turned it on there and didn't turn it on iOS because we're still working through how we want that UI to lay out, right? And so in that kind of case, and maybe we'll turn it on for some percentage of the users and test it, right? And so, we basically think through like, what are the features that make sense? I think the one piece that we're a little different than people that kind of go crazy with tons of feature flags, is that we actually try to like think through like, is this something we're going to want to potentially toggle on or off rather than adding a flag for everything? Simply because when you end up with a large number of flags, the interdependencies and the combinations become very hard to test. Even at the scale we're at with millions and millions of users, you just can't get to the combinations, and then you make a mistake. And, and developers are like, oh, well, you didn't have XYZ default on. You weren't running experiment 3, right? And so those kind of things. And so for certain things, we don't feature flag. And the fact that people used to ask early days, where you guys do A/B testing? And we're like, yeah, we do A/B testing every Friday. We ship a new build, right? And so like, as a startup, we were we would just make the change. And now the user base is bigger, right? With millions and millions of users using the app, we need to be a little more thoughtful in terms of how you roll that out. And so in this case, we are using some more flagging type feature flag stuff to enable those the users to see features in kind of waves.
So let's walk through this. I think I heard it called Shipping Friday. So every Friday you shipped. What would you do if there was a bad release out in the field for a week?
I mean, it'd be very hard for it to ever show up in a week. Like we would notice it, so our process basically is we plan the day on Monday, review kind of the previous week's work, code Tuesday through Friday. We ship to testing on Friday, test Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. We have a team that basically does testing overnight on those 3 days. Monday morning, we get the report, and then we decide to push it. We push it to our beta users. And so there's a lot of gates. Kind of there's a set of QA and kind of manual testing that happens over the weekend. There's a beta test kind of dog food that happens the first few days of the week. Then we kind of push it live. And like I said, those kind of things, if it's a really, and so we can split the platform, right? So if it's an Android bug, we usually can fix it like within an hour. It's very quick to push a new Google app or an Android app. With an iPhone issue or iOS issue, we have to determine the severity of it. And if it's something that needs a critical fix, we'll push the red button with Apple that says we need expedited review, which usually can bring the time down from a week down to about 24 hours. But no guarantees, like it's just best effort. And so that's what we do. Now, there's many cases where we disable features, right? Like IMAP, for example, we turned on, we started seeing a lot of problems. We turned it off to a few countries that we saw more problems from, and it was very popular IMAP servers in those countries we didn't support. And so we just disabled it on a geo basis. And so there are places where we've turned off things where we had to put a feature flag in place to do that, but it really depends on the feature. Some big UI changes are hard to feature flag, and so those you have to deal with. But fortunately, those cause a lot less crashes because UI is just not as unstable of code as the kind of core sync code.
Is there ever something that you really wish that you'd put a feature flag on that you didn't?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. I think, we shipped iOS 9 on the day iOS 9 launched and had a crasher. So there was a migration bug. And so, but I don't know how you could have turned off iOS 9, right? Like, some of these things and then, we pushed the button and it took us 2 days. So we had to eat 1-star reviews for 2 days, which was super painful, but
they hurt.
Yeah. They're pretty permanent.
Well, they hurt, and then they write mean things, and it just stings. Yeah, I got, a trip that we were over all 5, but when you get a 1-star, you feel the pain personally.
Yep. Yeah. You get thick skin.
So you were saying you're releasing something to testers over the weekend, and then it goes out to the beta channel the next week. Yeah. So if the testers gave you a bad report and you needed to pull it, then you end up in the situation of, I presume, of instead of a week's changes going out, you now have 2 weeks changes going out, and if that's bad, it might stack up with 3 weeks changes, and then suddenly you're out of continuous delivery. You've got a big risky release going out. Any experiences with that? Yeah, so
we've had that frequently. So usually what happens though is because you've only written code for 4 days, I always say, like, if it takes us 4 days to write the code, we should be able to fix it within 4 hours. And so we fix it Monday and just ship it and take the risk that, hey, we thought we'd, extra code reviews, very aggressive look, and then we ship it to dog food. So we usually very rarely skip an entire week where we pull through that. We almost always find a way to ship it, and everybody kind of rallies around that as a cultural thing. Is it like, hey, if there's something wrong or a crasher comes through and we can't fix it, like it's kind of all hands on deck to sort that out.
Right.
And the one piece I did miss is we internally dog food every check-in, right? And so the way that our system works is when you check in code, whether it's on the app or on the service, within about 3 minutes, it's pushed to your phone. And so, the service has been updated. And so the service is constantly updating with every check-in. And so things that are very critical, and so we say, well, what's a critical bug? Well, I can't send email, or I can't reply or forward, or like a button doesn't work. Like that stuff's found like within minutes of it being checked in, because there's the dev team's relatively large and we're all running that app. And so we're seeing those kind of things like, whoa, I don't like this, jump on chat and tell everybody like, hey, let's go look at this.
Gotcha. So you just stop shipping new things if there's if there's a problem, you like all hands on deck to fix the actual problems.
Yep. And you, like I said, usually with, when you only had 4 days of change kind of at the maximum, usually within a few hours, we can figure out what's going on and either disable it, right? Like, for example, in the case of when we shipped the iOS 9 crasher, it was with Spotlight indexing. It was the new kind of indexing feature in iOS 9. We just disabled Spotlight indexing, cut a new build, and we shipped it within an hour. So like most, again, it's never perfect. The software is an imperfect trade, but most things we can figure out soon enough or be able to kind of roll it back or disable it.
Right. One of the big releases that I was part of that went badly on this kind of thing was the Firefox 4 release. So it took 18 months to go from Firefox 3 to Firefox 4. And the main reason was, there'd be a big feature that would go out, and the big feature would be buggy and would need a lot of work, and so it wasn't ready to go out. And in the meantime, other teams are getting it, working on their own thing. Things are getting included, and in the end, something that was supposed to be a 6-month release ended up taking 18 months before it went out.
Yeah,
and there was stuff that was ready, new CSS features, the sort of thing that you don't want to wait 18 months to be released.
Compatibility stuff.
Yeah. That was the catalyst for completely changing to the continuous release model.
So you talked about dog fooding. How much do you dog food? Do you require everybody to only do email on their mobile?
We don't. So we've actually, there are cases where, we block, we could block, or we don't though. Fortunately, everybody uses mobile email. And so, it's a pretty light ask. It's not like we're building an app that people would not normally use on their daily basis. So I think the biggest thing is that generally developers on the team don't have the email volume that matches our user base. So generally developers don't get crazy long 120 message threads and gajillion attachments and super long complex HTML in the messages. And so I think the bigger problem is not about people using the app. It's about the data, kind of the representation of the data matching our kind of wider user base.
Yeah. I asked because Facebook legendarily does not allow people to use Google products. So for example, they use Microsoft Bing instead of Google.
Yeah. No, I think companies have those rules. And I think for a long time, Microsoft they would only pay for your cell phone if you used a Windows mobile phone. So I think that, these are common, ways of trying to encourage folks to use and I think those are great. And they work, but I think there's always exceptions to the rule. And I think that, you also can come blind to competitors by only focusing on your own stuff. And you end up with tunnel vision of saying, hey, all I know is how my stuff works with everything else. And I've never worked in a kind of quote unquote real world universe where everything is different. Like where you live in, you have Mac, you have Windows, you have this phone, I have Android devices, I have, with Android in particular, right? There's how many different versions of Android that are out there in the wild today on all kinds of different hardware. And even from the same vendor, there could be, but we can see bugs between Samsung devices, right? And so I think we encourage people to use what they have. People are allowed to expense or buy whatever phone they want. Lots of the team members, especially kind of those of us in support that are, dealing with customers, have multiple phones. We have different tablets and phones that are our personal devices that are connected, and we're using them, kind of switching between them because that's what customers are doing, right? They're looking at all these platforms, and so being familiar with them is one, but also just being able to catch issues.
So one of the questions that, or one of the things we talked about with Chris last week was the trade-off between doing continuous delivery and in delivering polish, and Acompli had this reputation as being this incredibly polished product that people loved using. It was the best Gmail app I think on iOS was the description I've heard. So how do you feel that trade-off works where you have something which is such like a high degree of polish? How does it affect what you're shipping and how you ship?
First of all, thank you. It's awesome. Yeah, I think we got lots of accolades for our polish, and I think we always thought that we could do better. Like the founders were all kind of like plumbers, right? We all worked on infrastructure and backend systems, so UI wasn't our thing. So the thanks really goes to the folks on the mobile team, the kind of the experts we hired in that space that really like to hone their craft. But it was a constant tension, right? Like there's always this notion of, kind of the startup lever of, you have to get function and utility, and we're building a utility, we're building an email client. Like if it's missing big features, like people just can't use it. Like if delete is missing and reply all is missing and certain features are missing, you can't use it. And so no matter how polished the send button is, like it doesn't matter if you can't do reply all and it doesn't support BCC and those kind of things. And so there was always this tension between, how do we get polish and utility? And I think we could have got a more beautiful app but potentially a less functional app, and who knows how that would have affected the outcome if we would have spent more time on polish and vice versa. But I think what I've learned now is, another team joined Microsoft just after we did called Sunrise. It was a calendar,
right?
And they were like world-renowned design, right? Like a really, really beautiful design. And you asked them how they kind of went to their sprints and delivery, and their model was more like every 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and it was done when it was beautiful was kind of their mantra, versus us, it was done on Friday,
right?
And so they brought to now we've kind of have a combined team, we're working together, and they've brought this notion of, oh my gosh, they basically spend all this time getting the design perfect and honing it, and then but we are able to ship it every week. And so the way that we do that now is the design starts about 2 or 3 weeks ahead of the actual work, and so we're allowed to get the designs, much more time to kind of allow that polish to happen and those designs and mocks to come back very, very high fidelity, so that when we implement it, we know what we're doing. Where Acompli kind of did design and implementation almost in the same week. We would design stuff, spec it on Monday, design it on Tuesday, build it on Wednesday and Thursday, quick kind of put some paint on it on Friday, and then ship it on Monday, right? And so it just didn't give you time to kind of get to complete beautiful. And I think now that with the Sunrise and kind of integrating that process, and the team that they brought over is really upped our game on the UI side.
So if you're looking for beautiful, it seems, or if you're looking for functional and beautiful, I guess, then shipping constantly would seem to be a helping hand there. But they literally just like spent 6 or 7 weeks working it internally.
Yeah, they would work it internally and continue to polish it and get the feature and the UX just right. And until they decided, hey, now this new chunk of work is done.
And would that involve like user testing and
tons of
gotcha.
User testing,
right,
data
right.
research, and then it also helped because as a startup, like you become immune to the press. Like if you're releasing every week and you're like, hey, look at this, look at this, look at this, the press stops writing about you.
Yeah.
And so the Sunrise did an amazing job of kind of packing up that 6 week with something a little bigger and dropping a bigger hammer and saying, this is something big and amazing, write about it. And so
right.
a lot of the press and kind of attention they got was because they were able to kind of drop these slightly larger releases than a traditional 1 week kind of bite. That gave them that more additional attention.
I think that's really interesting. I remember one of these sort of software marketing 101 things that I think Joel Spolsky talked about years and years ago was that the biggest thing that they could do to get press was just increase the version number. So Fogbugs 5 or 6 or whatever was,
major version.
Just got a 20% or 30% customer increase just by existing. And now with continuous delivery, we've kind of killed that. No one talks about the new version of almost anything. I don't think anyone's ever talked about the new version of Facebook. There's the new news feed and things you can yell about, but it's not like we've gone to Facebook 37 now and it's amazing.
I disagree with you, Paul.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's just that what's gone away is the notion of versioning. But yes, Facebook does a very good job about announcing new features. So does Twitter. Like they push this moments, and the number is an arbitrary thing, but they're definitely still pushing.
It feels like it's not. So I think there's two things I'm saying. One is that releasing features feels like less than releasing a whole new version, and then the second thing is that companies of Facebook size and that sort of thing and Google size, do good jobs of it. Whereas small startups, it is very difficult for small startups to be able to do the same thing when they have that continuous delivery cadence.
I think it's just hard for small startups to get press. Period.
Yeah, and you talked about moments, right? And we always talked about like what's the next product moment. And even in inside of a company like Microsoft, that's important too, because like with Microsoft, you have different kind of competing events, which is there's always lots of things to talk about, and aligning your kind of moment with they're launching Windows 10 or they're launching Office or they're launching the new Xbox. There's very, very large events that are like the NFL is switching to the next version of Surface. Like these are huge product moments, and like I want to talk about my little feature in my app, right? Mm-hmm. And I say little, but I mean even at the scale right with millions and millions of users, it's still in the scale of like the NFL switching to the new Surface Pros. Like that's pretty cool, right? Like, and so you have to kind of, there's a marketing strategy and PR strategy, and how that aligns with continuous is tough, right? I think we struggle with that all the time of trying to pick when to turn things on and when to say, and what things you group together and what's the story. Because we always figured as a startup, it's like it's not about the feature or the moment or what version you are, it's the story you're telling. And the version was the easiest way to tell the story kind of 10 years ago. Right. And today the story is about like, we're launching this new capability or this new feature or this new thing, right? And that's the story now.
I think it's very easy for companies like Apple, and I see AWS doing this as well, that they just have this event that everybody pays attention to, everybody listens to, and so they get to announce in a list of features. But I remember Amazon launched some changes to code deploy in the last re-event, and I don't know if people really care that much about the new features that has gone into code deploy, but it got a mention because it got packaged in with all this, all the other 50 other changes that had happened to AWS, and all of the press and everyone was paying attention to it that week.
Yeah, I think they do a great job of focusing their moments and having a kind of a train of moments, right? And say, hey, this is going to be train week, and they get people to come show up, and that they've got a writer that's assigned to sit in every session and write about it. They're going to write about it, right?
Yeah,
There's nothing else they're going to do all day, right? And so I think, but they're able to create that.
You almost have to justify the fact that you've sat in this session for the last hour. You have to write something, even if it's the worst thing ever.
Yep.
Yeah, well, it goes back to, a lot of startups get paralyzed by fear. They're like, what if we release a feature and TechCrunch writes about it? I'm like, TechCrunch is not going to write about your feature.
Right.
Generally speaking, right? The press is, there's just too many other things to write about because they're more interesting in writing about the startup you'd never heard of that got $5 million or $8 million. Right. That's more interesting than your feature because they've already wrote about you and people roughly know what you do and you're not completely changing the world.
So I want to detour from press back to something interesting.
Sure.
You said you told me that your app was loved by users and by IT. So in this world of rapid builds, how did you also win the love of IT?
Yeah, so our view, and coming from the enterprise world, is that you don't get to choose what software you use at work, and we felt that was kind of a big sea of change that's going to come over the next couple of decades. Is that people, and especially with mobile, are getting to choose what apps they run on their phone and using them for work, whether IT has sanctioned them or not. Right? You look at the Dropboxes of the world as a obvious
consumerization
example.
of the enterprise.
Consumerization, right? And so then as you do that, you say, okay, well, let's go build things that people love. But I think, again, Dropbox is a great example of building something that people love, but they've had trouble convincing IT that it's the right solution, where Box, I think, has done a better job of that because Box went down a much more IT checklist, right? And so when I look at it, there's a security and IT checklist that's required to get to the IT person, but there's no checklist or kind of easy way to get to users to love you. And so we spent the better first year and a half focusing on getting users to love what we built and iterating like crazy and moving and continuously to get them there. And then the plan and the kind of the thinking was we had all these enterprise trials and one very large enterprise customer with Acompli before Microsoft acquired us was, hey, we're starting to work down the enterprise checklist because they're going to tell you what they want. Like it's very clear. Like I need this SSL thing and I need this HIPAA thing and I need this FedRAMP thing. Like they're going to tell you what those requirements are, and they're not fun, but they're very explicit of. In fact, your choice trying to negotiate. Hey, can I do a smaller version of that? So I think the mix there is and then once you get it in there, one of your sales angles is, hey, oh, by the way, your users are already using this for home or on the work and on their work accounts, and they're going to love it when you roll it out, and it's by far the best thing you'll trial in kind of a bake-off, right? And so that was our strategy to go to market, was to say, hey, let's make it so users love it, spend a bunch of time on that, use that for press and branding, and then go to the IT folks and get them to buy it.
Did they ever challenge you on the weekly builds and how that would affect the stability?
So they didn't. I think the challenge was more around security and data locality and things of that nature. Was initially the speed of change didn't seem to be a huge deal. In mobile in particular, like I said, the actual thing that the users were touching, people are so used to mobile apps updating that's not a problem. I think it was more around data security and compliance around the data platform, and we had strategies to deal with that. Either keeping the data, accessing it through a secure line or VPN or dedicated lines, or using dedicated tenants in AWS or Azure and those type of things. So there was ways to kind of get around the compliance thing, but the key thing was really where the data was and data compliance, and less about how quickly you were updating it.
Awesome.
Well, thanks, Kevin, for coming in. Do you have any final thoughts around software development or continuous delivery?
I don't. I think it's cool. So my thing is that if the faster you go, things break, but the right things break, right? And so I think when we got acquired by Microsoft, everybody's like, well, no other team can ship every week. This is like good. That's fun. That was fun as your little startup thing. And I had this deck that I present where it's like, hey, we ship every week and we drink beer on Fridays and release on Mondays, and they're like, that's cool. And it was like a novelty thing. And so they were like, it'll just never work. And so things that were like, it's going to take a week to sign the build because we have all these special requirements. And we say that, yes, but at the end of the day, like we're going to push a button and it takes 22 seconds. That's what it used to be for. And so they're like, no, we'll give you a special deal. It'll be like 1 day. And we're like, no, that's not possible. We need 22 seconds. And we finally got it to work. But those kind of things, we had to break these internal processes and reviews. And a lot of times it wasn't just a process, but a team involved to kind of help that you can't have humans involved in some of these processes. And so a lot of the continuous thing is how do you automate automate and say, look, we'll do everything you're asking us to do, but just let us codify it so that we can push the button and it does it, and we'll trust that we're doing what you asked. And that's the way we kind of got to back to that kind of high speed delivery. And we're shipping 7 days in a very, very large company.
Wow, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the tools that make all this happen.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of craziness in there. So a lot of the tools that were involved were tools that most of us know today. It's Perl scripts and shell scripting and PowerShell and .NET, and it's just code, right? I mean, so like what does it take to sign an Apple build, right? You have to run the Apple's code signing tools and have to have the cert, and you have to have access to it. And so a lot of it was network VPNs to be able to have the right access to the certs on the right boxes when you're making that, and you used to have to use a smart card, so we needed 2-factor auth to sign the build, and so you have to literally stick your smart card in my laptop, my Windows laptop, to get the cert to sign the Android build, right? And so those kind of things, we said, well, look, there's got to be a way to automate this. How do we go get 2 developers? We're going to do 2-factor. It's going to be me and Paul, and we're going to both say the build shipped and it's been reviewed, and then the automated process kicked off. And so those kind of things we just had to kind of re-envision. But the beauty of setting the goal is 7 days. We're going to ship every 7 days, and just finding all the things that broke and kind of going after them and just breaking them and saying, nope, we can't do that. We can't do that. We need this access. We don't need that access. This step was like, we need to review political correctness, right? And make sure that there's no kind of offensive words, because we ship to so many different countries. And how do we do that? And it's like, well, there's tools for that, and that requires submitting it to this team and waiting. It's like, no. Well, at the end of the day, that's going to be a code and run. Like, how do we just ship that over there and automate it? So it ends up being an automation thing. It's just much like DevOps today. There's teams all around the world with 1 or 2 people running thousands and thousands of servers with automation. And so if you kind of box the requirements into it has to go quickly, and it has to just work. You have to just kind of write the code to close that gap. And so that's kind of what we did.
So when you were making that transition, I guess when you went in, you were shipping once a week.
Yeah.
And did you just refuse to break that once a week thing, or did you submit to their thing and then try to get it back to once a week?
So we refused. So when we first got acquired, we were still shipping as a Comply and under our own rules, and we kept shipping. And then in parallel, we knew we were making the switch to rebrand as Outlook. And so as we started the rebrand, it took us about 6 weeks to go from rebranding to get to Outlook to ship. But we knew that as that was going, like, it's taking us 6 weeks. We'd be like, oh, where's the cert at? Well, how do you rename this? What font should you use? Like, where's the logo file? Like, a lot of things were like one-time things. And so those did take a while. But I think the first couple weeks, we were probably shipping more like every 10 days. So it was a little longer. And there was a lot of manual elbow grease and like escalation emails and phone calls and things that were just, kind of more elbow grease than required to kind of get us through the process, where we got it to a point now where it's like, it wasn't fun developing the first few times, right? And so...
Did you have any stuff where on your end it was automation, but the API that you were hitting was a manual process?
Multiple, yeah. I mean, send us an email and we'll sign your build. And we're like, no, what are you going to do? So it was literally kind of interrogation. Like, what? Okay, when I send you an email and I ask for this request, or I fill out this form, what actually happens? And then you had to sit there and pull on the string and say, okay, and then you copy it to this, and then, okay, so you have a password for this thing. Like, how does this thing work? Okay, great. And then you're going to copy it to here. It's like, okay, great. So it ends up needing to go into this directory that only you have access to. Okay, we need access to that directory, and we'll copy it there.
Right.
Okay, great. And then the tool automatically picks up and signs it. Oh, okay, perfect. So a lot of it was, figuring out the human mechanics of it for sure, and then figuring out where the code is that we can go write it. So
Kevin, you felt so strongly that the 7 days versus 10 was worth it.
For sure. No, it was incredibly valuable to our kind of getting to where we were in Acompli. And we felt that if we had any chance of kind of hitting the goals that we had set for ourselves and that the board had set for us when they acquired the company in terms of growth, and that we had to get to 7 days and basically be able to iterate as quickly. Otherwise, the targets we set were going to take us 3 or 4 times longer, because for every time you lengthen the development cycle, I'm pretty firm believer now that it takes you that much longer to actually get your results, right? So if, the whole game is how many shots do you have on the goal? And if you can do 50 a year, you're a lot better off than the team that can only do 20, right? And so I think that was the fundamental thing, is that we can make 50 changes a year, and the size of the changes is not as important as how many you can make and how quickly you can iterate on that.
Well, great. We really enjoyed you sharing your stories.
Yeah,
cool. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of To Be Continuous, brought to you by HeavyBit and hosted by me, Paul Bigger of Circle CI, and Edith Harbaugh of Launch Darkly.
To learn more about HeavyBit, visit heavybit.com. While you're there, check out their library, home to great educational talks from other developer company founders and industry leaders.